Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. You know, I've got a good job, I've got a good family, my wife loves me, but man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable, I'm suffering, I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, you know, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so. But other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job? Or how about a career, or failing that, a job? It's like, well, I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and you know, that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life, and you can find out if they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no, no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life, multidimensionally. Like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting, because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement, or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony, in some real sense, of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. You know, now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner, you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children, let's say. You need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? They have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. Are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that's just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure, regardless of its scope? And the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal.
People think that my knees are bad from a lot of running, and they're wrong. I wasn't born healthy. I wasn't born with some great body alignment, some great, I have sickle cell, I have all kind of health issues. I had a choice to make. And the choice was, growing up, okay, this hurts, that hurts. We can just sit down and do nothing. Or we can see how far we can push the human body. So on that journey, as I started getting more and more into my mind and started realizing that while what I'm capable of doing, my mind got stronger. So the pain in my knees, while it sucked, I've been doing it for so long. It was like it became my new norm. Like, okay, my knees hurt, and I call it like stop feeling sorry for yourself, but you sometimes have to ignore your feelings. For me, I made a decision, and my decision was to be the best person I could. I basically, a lot of mornings I wake up and say, "F your feelings." And that doesn't mean like, don't take it literally, "F your feelings," but sometimes you have to go beyond what you're feeling. And my knees were, but guess what? I wanted to run. And I knew that, okay, you can get knee replacements, this and that. Like I said, it wasn't because of I ran too much. People always want to say, oh man, you ran so much so you f your body. You know, you don't want to be like David Goggins. I hear it all the time. You don't want to be like David Goggins. I studied the darkness. You find no answers in the light. None. It's too happy. It's too nice. And we don't need to be taught how to live in happiness. That just comes naturally to us. Happy moments, but the dark times, man, you can't get there unless you put yourself there. Life will take you there. But when you get into those dark moments, it's what people, how are you able to write like this, man? I go to such places in my mind and I study the darkness. Like, it's not just physical. When I was growing up and I saw my mom getting beaten, I got beat, and I was some stuttering little black kid in an all-white school, and I'm on stage and I gotta say one line in front of 15 people, and I walk off stage because I can stutter. All those insecurities and all those things, man, I used to go home and cry. I'm like, my God, man, hang on, man. As I got older, we got to study. The only way we're going to get through this is study it. So every time I'm in a dark moment and life's up around me, whether it be physical or just life, I get in it, man, with a pen and paper. I'm like, okay, this sucks. I can feel like I'm losing my I can study this. You can't fit discipline into that. You can't fit structure. You can't fit consistency. You can't fit the grind. And then when you try, it just gets overrun by the clutter in your mental garage. I got to a point in my life where I realized this is life. And so I move on past things real quick. So people are like, oh my God, what are you going to do, David, if you can't run? I'll swim. Or I'll go to college, or I'll do something else. Like, this isn't my life. I'm very aware how quick life can take from you. And I've always prepared my mind for the next chapter. And what happened with me was I started this thing called front loading. So when I was young, I used to be a little piece of, like, oh, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. I can't do that. And the second I got my head out of my ass and I realized, man, you can achieve a lot of you get off your ass and start moving, and you start motivating yourself. Start becoming a self-motivator. So I started front loading. Every time I'm in a bad situation, I study it. And that's the only reason I do half the shit I do, is I'm studying this, because I know that I never thought I was going to be writing books and trying to help people get better. But I was always trying to do it because I knew I sucked. And so when you know you're trying to get somewhere, you know you suck, you know that you believe that you're a born loser, you are taking snapshots, man. Like, you see something on your phone, like, oh man, I'm going to take a snapshot of that. I do that in my mind. So I get in these moments where I'm like, okay, wow, that's good knowledge right there, man. I snapshot it because I know that I can use that later. I can use this because I'm not out there most people, they go out and they run. And they go out and do, and they're like, oh, this is beautiful. Look at mountains. And no, I don't like it. My body hurts. I'm hurting. How do we get through this? It's a lab. It's my mental lab.
There's a study I read about stress, and it was saying that stress has a placebo effect attached to it, because the placebo effect is extremely powerful. So they found some of the most stressed people in the world, and they split them into two groups. And they're all equally stressed. They all have a bunch of cortisol in their blood.
Yeah.
The people who believed that stress was bad for you and that stress can hurt you, and they believed those media articles, were dying earlier. They were having heart attacks and having stress-related illnesses. The people who believed the opposite, who just said, stress is part of being successful. I like stress. When I feel stressed, I do my best. It makes me anxious. It turns my brain on. I like being stressed. Lived longer than average.
Yeah.
The point is, the same drug, how you look at it and how your body anticipates it, how you feel about it, affects the real world result. I say this all the time. I say the best things that ever happened to me are the worst things that ever happened to me. All the trauma and I've been through in my life are the best things that ever happened to me, because as a man, if you've not had a difficult life, you cannot be good at being a man. Being a good man and being good at being a man, they're two slightly different things. But to be good at being a man, you need to have been through so much shit that when the Matrix deletes your entire life from the internet and starts lying about you at mass, and people start doing protests wanting you fucking hung, and they're looking for your family members, and reporters start calling every ex-girlfriend you've ever had, trying to convince them and bribe them to lie, to come out and say you're something you're not. When they're genuinely out to put you in jail, that you can sit there and be focused and stoic enough to go, you know what? Okay, what's the chessboard? What's gonna happen? Who's trying to shoot me right now? Nobody. Okay, so it's better than it was a couple years ago. Okay, so X, Y, Z, and plan through it, right? You're never gonna be capable as a man if you've not had trauma. The best men ever have had trauma. If you call a police officer, you need a brave police officer. He ain't gonna be brave unless he's been through. He's not gonna be brave unless he's been through shit. So we also, as a society, sit and look at men and go, we want, well, there's two kinds of society. There's the Matrix society, but the true society, the true women with a brain. They actually, I want a man who's strong, who's supportive, who's intelligent, who financially provides, etc. Then you're gonna want a man to some degree who's been through some shit. Yeah. And a man who's internalized it and used it as a weapon. And this is what I say to people. People email me their long lists of all the bad things that happened to them, and I reply, fantastic. You are so lucky. You have all the building blocks to become the exact kind of man you want to be. If none of this shit happened to you, when something else bad happens to you later, you wouldn't be able to deal with it. Fantastic. And he goes, no, but you know, this. He replied again with more excuses and said, why are you making excuses? I just told you what happened to you is a good thing. You need to reframe your mind. Bad things happened to Batman. They killed his parents. Do you understand? That's why he's Batman. You've just told me you have the building blocks to become the most, you might become top G when I retire. Fantastic. What are you complaining about? He goes, well, what do I do? I said, you need to work. Take all that trauma. If you're truly heartbroken, my friend, and we've all been there as men, if you're truly heartbroken, you can't sleep. That means you're going to get in fantastic shape. You better hit the gym. You have nothing else to do. Stop watching YouTube. Stop emailing me. I want pictures of you in the gym. Get to fucking work. Heartbreak's a fantastic motivator, as is depression, as is sadness. Great. Look at what's pissing you off and make sure it never happens again. If you were jacked and rich as she probably wouldn't have left your ass. So get your shit together. I don't think motivation is a real thing. I don't believe in motivation as a concept. I think discipline is real, and I also think discontentment is real. And I don't think it's possible for anybody to stay in a scenario where they're truly uncomfortable. If you fall asleep on your arm and your arm really starts to hurt, even in the deepest sleep, you're going to wake up and move your arm. If you sit there and your life has been in a rut for 7 years, you are semi-comfortable in that rut. Sure, there's days you're pissed off. Sure, you're semi-annoyed by it. But there's also days where you just play video games, eat pizza, and you're kind of cool with it, and it's no big deal. If you were truly unhappy and uncomfortable and discontent with your scenario, you wouldn't be in it. So I don't believe there's anybody who's truly, when I was broke, I couldn't sleep. Yeah. I'm not saying that, please understand me. When I was broke, I couldn't sleep. I'd be trying to go to bed thinking, how the fuck these people have Ferraris? I want a Ferrari. I couldn't sleep.
If I had to open a coffee shop, if I sit in a coffee shop, right? If I sit in Starbucks, the whole time I'm in there, not only am I thinking about how they got the money from me and how much I spent, I'm thinking about how I could outcompete them. I'd sit there and go, okay, cool. I'm in Starbucks. I spent £5.68. I got a latte and I got a donut, and I'm sitting here. And that business place, that commercial property right across the street is available for lease. How could I outcompete this coffee shop which just took my money? What's the profit margin on this £5.68? How much did this cost them? The coffee, pennies. Donut, 30p maybe, right? How much is the staff? They pay the staff minimum wage £8 an hour. So I've already paid 30 minutes work from that brokey. The wage, she's there for another 30 minutes for free, right? How much is the rent? How much is the business rates? If I had to open up there, how would I attract people to come into my shop as opposed to their shop? They got a big brand name. I'm brand new. Okay, well, the working here is ugly. My one's going to be hot. Boom, that's the beginning. Next thing, do they have any signage outside? No, I'm gonna try and put some signage outside. Do they have parking? No, I need parking. But you need to start thinking about how you can convince people to give you their money as opposed to giving it to the places they already give it.
Different analytics.
And once you do that, people say, I can't think of how to make money. If you start doing that for a year and just keep a notepad, you'll have 100 ideas of how to make money. You'll sit there and go, there's a place here that's doing this, and we could do it better this way. This place online is doing this, we can do it better this way. And then to get them all done, what do you need? Network. You need people. It's all about people. Then you need to either go in the war room if you want to join, or have your people around you and say, okay, we can make money with this. Who's going to do it? Who's not lazy? Who's getting up at 4 a.m. tomorrow? Boom, let's get it done. So there's unlimited ways to make money, but most people go through life and their money is taken from them, and they don't even identify how they got tricked out of it.
They're just happy with it.
Yeah, they just have. How did I spend 16 grand in Cirque last night? Oh, because my ass got drunk. How'd they get me drunk? Well, because the guy, when I first bought the first bottle of champagne, was there on the table, pouring, putting it in my hand, got me drunk, then I spent 16 grand on bottles. That's how they got my money. So if I open a club, I need to make sure when people first come in, they get hammered. Nobody thinks about it that way. Nobody thinks, how did they get that out of me? Right? Why am I spending $2,000 for dinner in Novikov? Is it the food, or is it the fact that I'm in Novikov and tag myself in Novikov? You have to identify how you're getting famoosed, how you're getting finessed. That's how you do it. But most people just walk through life getting finessed left, right, and center, giving all their money up. Oh, how did that happen?
You got to learn to finesse other people.
Yeah, but it's not finessing in a negative way.
It's in a good way.
It's a good way. You have to take money from other people. That's the only way you're going to make money.
Yeah.
You have to take it. There's a pimp, and he said a really intelligent line. He said, "Business is just other people's money." That's all business is. I want to start a business, so you want other people's money. That's what you want. So how are they going to give it to you? You have to think about it. Nobody thinks about it. And the easiest way to think about it is to think how you're giving yours away. That's a mental model you should adopt.
Yeah.
And you'll end up with loads of business ideas. Business ideas are everywhere. It's just execution, which is difficult.
Your ability to speak freely is directly correlated to your insignificance. When nobody listens to you, you can say what you want. If you get a platform and start talking, you will learn very quickly how you're not allowed to say what you want because people are listening. You're free to talk in an empty room. You're not free to talk to millions of people who are paying attention to you. So what we have now in the West is a society which is only linked and only bound by this false idea of freedom.
So it's really difficult.
It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. There's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind. You can do that in your own room. You can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. If you adopt an attitude that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are. The world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. So that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. There's two modes of being in the world, right? There's one where you adopt the responsibility for living properly, for being properly, and you make the sacrifices necessary for doing that, and then everything will flourish properly. And the other one is a pathway of resentment and bitterness and rejection and genocide. If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix. You can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility. What you're actually made of What you're made of is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that since you can do that? The fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. People denigrate the opportunities that are right in front of them. And there's no reason to do that, because what's right in front of you is the majesty of being. That's what's right in front of you. It's inexhaustibly complex and full of potential, and there's no reason to assume that wherever you happen to be isn't as good a starting place as anywhere else. Well, I know some people have terrible, terrible lives. They're in situations that are absolutely unbearable. But I also do know that even situations like that can be made a hell of a lot worse by the worst kind of attitude. That's for sure.
There's no room in that mind for discipline. There's no room for consistency. They may do it once or twice, but then the mind takes over and that garage comes in, and then it's like a circuit breaker, man. A circuit breaker just overloads and barks. And our minds, that's our mind, man. It's like a circuit breaker that has so much shit in it, you keep on loading it, you can't put any more into it. I talk about it in there, man, so much about clearing space in your mind so that you have room for all those disciplines. Waking up early, taking those, they do mean something. But we don't get to that dark matter that is keeping you from clearing out that mental garage.
We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described of people who were in a sort of hell in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't in some sense obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity. I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire, and then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that. When you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline, and one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, you know, who's suffering, that sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is extremely, I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So it's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities, but it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately, with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue. You know, and what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. You know, and that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, you don't understand that if you're in desperate straits, if your life has fallen apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself. So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, you know, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, you know, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer, you know, because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions, and those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. You know, maybe you're, I don't know, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, you know, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored, and if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them, and you know, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism. And if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous. And if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, and because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted. So multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the third mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working. And then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that the positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion. Because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation. And so far, and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous because, first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you, you know? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And so, and you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the Gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society. Life has proximal meanings, right? There's the meaning that you experience when you're engaged in a piece of art, or when you're reading, or when you're engrossed in a movie or in a conversation. There's the meaning that emerges within your relationships with people that you cherish or are enthusiastic with. There's meanings of security and predictability. There's meanings of duty and responsibility and active engagement with your job and your career. There's meanings of aesthetic pleasure. Now, all of those have their value, and each of them has their place. And, you know, maybe there's a hierarchy of value there as well, so that some of those meanings are deeper than others. And then you might say, well, what characterized the deepest of all meanings? And it would be something like relationship with the transcendent, and that would establish a relationship between you and what's always been conceptualized as God, which is generally supposed to be something ineffable, right? It's not definable, but you might think about it as the central animating spirit of the age, or the value around which all other values are organized, or the wisdom of the ages, or the creative spirit that possesses you when you're inspired, or what grips you with enthusiasm at a sports event or at a musical event, all of those things. And we need a relationship with that. And we find our deepest meaning in that relationship. And if we don't find it, I think if we don't find it in something that's explicitly religious, then we tend to magnify something of lesser value, say something political, into that to fill the void. So yes, life has proximal meanings without God, without eternity, but at the ultimate level, something's lacking. And it's the desire to fulfill that lack that, and maybe the lack itself, that's part and parcel of the religious instinct. So you can kill God, but you can't. That doesn't rectify the hunger for God. And then that hunger seeks out replacements. That's how it looks to me. So, and then, you know, you might also say, well, does that mean you have to believe in God? And I don't think of the proper answer to that is that you need to agree with a propositional statement. Does God exist? Yes. You know, like, is this table there? Yes. It's not that kind of relationship. I mean, it's characterized in the Old Testament as a struggle. So Israel means those who struggle with God. And you have to participate in that struggle. And you can do that, weirdly enough, as a believer or as a non-believer. Maybe sometimes more intensely as a non-believer. The issue might be more paramount then, the issue of virtue and the issue of the ultimate orientation. If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So It's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You'll get through it, and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got.
I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe. We can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, get you out of bed in the morning. And then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist, with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. It's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. You let all that nonsense burn away. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you could stop doing. Take on the consequences of error and learn from it, and then you win constantly, because even if something goes sideways, you think there's something to be derived from this. When you're in the world and something objects to you, something that matters objects to you, then in the entire unrealized world is in that thing that objects. It's all tangled up inside it. That's why it's the great dragon of chaos. It's everything that's outside of your conceptual structure. And what is that? It's everything that lurks outside of your walled city. And it's manifested itself like the snake in the garden. And the easiest thing to do is say, I'm not having anything to do with that. But the problem with that is, well, you get your C- and you don't do anything about it. Maybe you're a little bitter and more resentful, and your study habits get a little worse. So the next time you get like a D+, and then you collect a bunch of Fs, and then you stop going to school, and then you stop showering, right? Then you end up jumping off the bridge. And so that's how the dragon eats you, when you don't pay attention to it. And so it's no bloody wonder that people avoid, It's really no wonder that they avoid, because error messages contain within them the implicit world. Now, the upside of that is, Well, they contain within them the implicit world. And the world isn't all negative. And so maybe you get your C minus, and that's actually the best gift you ever got, because somebody finally took you and went, whack, you know, clue in. And so you take that apart and you think, oh, I don't know how to write. I don't know how to think. I've never read anything in my life. My study habits are abysmal, you know, like maybe I'm working at 2% efficiency, which it's like, you gotta, that's so, to find that out is so optimistic. I mean, if you're barely hanging in there, but you're only working at 2%, you might imagine what you could have as a life if you're working at like 50%. So that the C minus can be the best gift you ever had, and that's the gold that the dragon hoards. That's exactly what that means. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. And now it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible, but you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. You are the thing that is, and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C minus in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, well, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time. But now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiation. You know, you're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your, you know, your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So you can, I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where, you know, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. Life has got its rat's nest of miseries, and that's for sure. And maybe you could even make a categorical statement that life is mostly a rat's nest of misery. You know, and you can make a pretty powerful argument for that. But then there's a counter question, which is, well, what if you tried not to make it any more miserable than it had to be, right? Then what would it be like? I would suspect that most of that misery would go away, because it's the unnecessary misery that really brings you down. You know, it's like, well, if someone has cancer, it's like, that sucks. But it's not like you can say, if only we had done this differently, then that wouldn't have happened. But when someone's out like torturing you in a malevolent way, or maybe you're doing the same, you can always ask yourself, well, is this really necessary? Is this just like a useless add-on to the miseries of life? That's what disheartens people. And so even in your own life, if you aren't suffering from self-imposed misery, and you're only suffering from inescapable misery, maybe you could handle that, and even maybe without becoming irredeemably corrupt. And so the goal would be, well, yeah, life is a rat's nest of miseries, and maybe it has no ultimate meaning. We could say that if we're feeling particularly pessimistic, but it still leaves one question open, which is, if you didn't do everything you could to make it worse, how good could you make it be? And the least answer is, well, it could be tragedy, but maybe not hell.
What would you estimate are the boundaries between self-care and selfishness?
Well, that's a good follow-up question for what we've been just discussing. Well, the first thing we have to sort out there is, well, what do you mean by self? And people make memes about me because I'm always asking for word definitions. But, and it annoys people because they think, well, it's just, you know what that means. It's like, is God real? What do you mean by real? Well, you can't ask that. It's like, well, then you can't ask your question either. What do you mean real? Well, everyone understands that. It's like, really, we do we? We understand what's real. We've got that nailed down. What you're really asking is something like, here's what I am insisting that you regard as real, which is usually something like an objective materialism. Does God fit into that category? It's like, well, that's a completely different question than the one you asked. No, perhaps, is the answer to that question, but you didn't formulate the question reasonably, because when you formulate a question like, is God real? God's a mystery in that question, and so is real. And you don't get away with the axiomatic presupposition that you've got real nailed down, and all we have to do now is mop up God. It's not reasonable. It's not acceptable in the least. It's just a trick, and it's not a very sophisticated trick. And so in this situation, selfishness versus self-care, well, I think really the issue there is the definition of self. So whatever the self is very complicated, because it's really what you are at your core. That's the question. That's unbelievably complicated. It's like, what the hell do you know about who you are at your core? I mean, human beings we have no idea what we are in the final analysis. And so Carl Jung wrote books on the self. He believed Christ was a symbol of the self. It's a very complicated idea. And takes a lot of unpacking. You could think about the self as what it is that has demands right now. And when people attempt to define themselves subjectively, which has become something to be insisted upon in our current culture, they usually mean something like, the ultimate self is the whim that possesses me now. And that's a dubious proposition. What the whim that possesses you now is more accurately conceptualized as a fragmentary self. You know, if you have a 2-year-old and the 2-year-old wants something and has a little tantrum in the grocery store because of it, the impulsive demand that possesses that child in that context is a fragmentary part of the child, but it in no means is reflective of the totality of that person. And then you might ask yourself, well, what's the totality? And well, as I said, that's a very complicated problem, but the totality of a person is certainly their iterations across time. It's at least that, right? Because there's a past you, and there's a present you, and there's a future you, and whatever you is in the final analysis is the aggregation of all of that across time. And maybe the aggregation of all of your manifestations in every social context as well. And then I could say, well, if you're taking care of yourself wisely, then you're taking all of that into account simultaneously. And then if that's selfishness, then that could be viewed as a positive good. But if you're subordinating that greater totality to the impulses of a momentary whim, which you've defined as the self, then that's a very bad idea. All that's going to do is cause trouble and make you unpopular. And so I don't believe there's any difference between service to the highest self and service to other people. I think those are the same thing. And we can think about that technically too. So there's a lot of other people and there's only one of you. And you're going to interact with people in a multitude of ways across your life. And you could imagine this, is that if you play fair in every interaction, or if everyone you interact with walks away from your interactions having gained, then everyone is going to line up to play with you. And so, how is that going to be anything but good for you? How could anything possibly be better than that? Because you're outnumbered very badly. And so if all the people around you are inclined, because of the way you've conducted yourself, to facilitate your progress forward, why wouldn't that be the best thing for you that could possibly occur? And one of the things I've suggested to my audiences, and people seem to resonate with this quite deeply, is imagine yourself ill and bereft of capacity, suffering. You think, well, what might sustain you during such a time? This is the question that's posed in a marriage, for example, for better or for worse, let's say. And one answer is the fruits of the sacrifices that you offered in relationship to other people previously. And so what does that mean? Well, if you had been responsible and caring, mature, and self-sacrificing in the proper manner, and I don't mean martyrdom, like a nihilistic martyrdom or a resentful martyrdom, then you've stored up, to put it sort of coldly, social capital. And then people will be pleased to return the favor in times of desperation. And that way, if that was the case for all of us all of the time, then we'd be in a mutually sustaining web of interactions. And that's not exactly organizing your psyche, right, so that you can sail through suffering. It's more external. It's that you're storing up your sanity in the reciprocal goodwill that you've built up with other people. And to do that optimally, you do that in a spirit of something like playful love, if you do it optimally. And of course that's going to redound to your great benefit. But even better than that, it's going to redound to your great benefit in a way that's also simultaneously mutually beneficial to as many others as you're skillful enough to manage. This developmental psychologist named Jean Piaget. Piaget is a very interesting thinker. And he was motivated by, his life's goal was to reconcile science and religion. And modern analysts of Piaget generally regard him as a developmental psychologist. But he described himself as a genetic epistemologist. And by genetic, he meant one who analyzes the genesis of things or their beginning. And by epistemologist, he meant someone who analyzes structures of knowledge. And so what Piaget was trying to do was to understand how our structures of knowledge developed across time. He thought if you wanted to pursue philosophy, and even more deeply, let's say theology, then it would make sense to look at how knowledge structures develop from childhood forward, because they're simpler in childhood and you might be able to understand them better than having to dive right into adult cognition. And he got a long ways on his enterprise. I think farther than people realize. He's a very sophisticated thinker. And he had this theory of equilibration, which is a lovely theory. So an equilibrated system will maintain itself without outside compulsion. And you might think, well, that's what you want in a political system, right? Because you want to live in a state that you want to live in. And you all, in fact, live in a state, I don't mean California, I mean the United States. And California less so lately, by the way. You want to live in a state where you don't have to be compelled. You want to be part of an organization that you've bought into voluntarily. And it's so interesting, because that's actually one of the criteria by which you could judge the value of a state. Does the state have to impose its dictates by force? Or does the state offer you a vision that you voluntarily accept? And and celebrate. And I would say your country has been very, very good at that. I mean, the American dream is not a dream that merely possesses Americans. Right? It's a dream that in some sense has been offered to the whole world. And I would say, you might ask, well, what's the evidence for that? And I would say, how about the fact that people want to move here? That constitutes the evidence. And even though this country is far from perfect, that's not exactly the issue. The issue is it less imperfect than the other offerings? And the answer to that is, well, do people want to move here? And if the answer to that is yes, then that's the evidence. And clearly they want to move here, and there are reasons for that. And so, and the reason for that in some sense is because you're playing an equilibrated game. It's a game that will sustain itself without compulsion. And that's actually the definition of a game. So for Piaget, a game was a microcosm of the promised land. That's a good way of thinking about it, if you want to think about it theologically. So a game is an arrangement of vision shared by two or more players voluntarily. And so when two children decide to play a game together, maybe they decide to play house, the one child who's offering the game might say, do you want to play house? And the other child, say it's a boy and a girl, will say, yeah, I'd like to play house with you. And so then no force is required because both are voluntary participants, and then the children develop a shared vision, which is the confines of the game, to play house. And then they run the simulation, and if they run the simulation properly, then they both find it engaging, and the engagement is a marker for the quality of the game, and the game expands their capacity to perceive and act with skill in relationship to an important life goal, right? Establishing a permanent relationship, because that's what you're practicing when you're playing house. And if that's done optimally, then it doesn't require compulsion. And if the two children are very good at doing that together, then they want to repeat it and continue to develop their skill, and that's what a friendship is. And that's not based on power, right? That's not based on a power relationship. That's so cool to know that, because, you know, the cynics say, well, it's all about power, and they usually say that because they want it to be all about power. But really, but that isn't the basis for stable human relations. Stable human relations are based on the construction of equilibrated states. And if your marriage is equilibrated, you both want to be in it. Now, I mean, there'll be times when you don't, and you know, you need to abide by the fact that you've accepted some constraints so that, well, you're not equilibrated, you're not getting along, you don't just leave, right? You still fight it through and try to reestablish an equilibrated state. But the idea of equilibrated state is extraordinarily interesting, and it's a vision of paradise. And the proper vision of paradise is something like eternal play. That's a good way of thinking about it. And play is a better basis for the establishment of social relations than power by any measure, by any multitude of measures. And so properly selfish is an equilibrated state across multiple instantiations of games across a very long period of time in very many social contexts. And so if you're serving that, that's enlightened selfishness, you could say. But it's identical with treating other people in the best possible manner. It's the same thing. And we know that, you know, we have an ethos, our culture is predicated on an ethos, which is treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated yourself, or maybe more, love thy neighbor as thyself. And that means to act towards your neighbor as if he or she is capable of producing a sequence of Jacob's ladder-like goals across time, and that you're of the same nature, and that will increase the probability that that direction will be the one that makes itself manifest. And that's That's definitely the case. I mean, I had people in my clinical practice who had become embittered and resentful. They were often naive people, and people generally start out naive, who'd been betrayed. You know, and they regarded their loss of naivety as an increment in wisdom. And you see this with cynical people, right? And they think, well, I was naive and I got burned, and that's not going to happen again. And it's like, fair enough, that actually is an increment in wisdom, but you're in the desert at that point, right? I mean, the naivety wasn't a virtue, and the collapse is a catastrophe, but the place you end up with is not positive. But you're not going to say, well, I'm not going to drop my cynicism and go back to being naive, because that would actually be a reversal of the acquisition of knowledge. Plus, you know, what they say, once burned, twice shy. So then, well, what's the alternative to the cynicism that's induced by malevolence? And the answer to that is something like, it's something like courageous trust. So imagine that you want to bring the best out of people, even though now you know that there's plenty of the worst there too. And the answer is, well, the question is, how do you do that? And the answer doesn't seem to be by facing everyone with a pervading spirit of distrust and bitterness. That just doesn't seem to work. And you might think, well, that's justified because I've been burned multiple times. Why wouldn't I do that? And the answer has to be something like, because you have the courage not to. Right? If you're not going to fall back into a foolish naivety and not allow yourself to be twisted into nihilism by bitterness, then your option is something like, well, I know perfectly well that you're full of snakes, but I'm going to extend my hand anyway, based on the faith that if you have the courage to do that, that the being that you will call out of the other person is thereby rendered most likely to be of the upward stumbling type. And I think that's the case. You know, you see people who are very sophisticated in their perceptions and social ability, and they can interact even with people who are quite corrupt and still increase the probability quite dramatically that the interaction will be positive. And that's part of that impulse towards the development of an equilibrated state. And so to reach out your hand like that to your fallen brother, let's say, without being naive, that's part and parcel of acting out that highest order conception of the self. That's the logos. That's how that works. So that's an answer to that question.
Is mental health genetic, habit, or personality? And how can you improve or master it?
Yeah, well, it's all of those things, you know. You might say, well, it's unfair that it's genetic. Well, look, we all have different temperaments, okay? There's 5 dimensions of temperament. Extroversion, that's sensitivity and threshold for positive emotion. Neuroticism, that's sensitivity and threshold for negative emotion. Agreeableness, that's kind of maternal compassion and empathy versus a kind of tough, more individualized, what would you call it?
Decisiveness.
Yeah, good. Conscientiousness, that's dutifulness, industriousness and orderliness. Openness, that's creativity and interest in ideas. 5 dimensions. Okay. Where you land on those dimensions is determined to a large degree by the genetic lottery. And now there's some movement on each dimension that can occur as a consequence of socialization, but it's bounded by the place you landed when the cards were dealt, by the genetic code when you were born. And you might say, well, that's unfair. It's like, well, it's not unfair exactly. It's just, there's a randomness about it within a bounded world. And it's not unfair partly because every advantage comes with a disadvantage. So if you're extroverted, you're social and you're positive, but you're impulsive. and you can tilt towards hedonism, and you can't stand being alone. If you're high neuroticism, well, you suffer a lot of anxiety and pain, but you're pretty sensitive to threat, and you might see danger before anyone else does, and then you don't die. And so, and maybe your children don't either. And if you're agreeable, well, you're compassionate and caring, but you're going to not stand up for yourself very well, and your temptation is going to be bitterness and resentment. If you're conscientious, well, you're orderly and industrious, but you can get obsessive. And if you're creative, well, then you end up with purple hair and nose rings. And I did a study at Harvard in like 1994 when piercing and tattooing started to first emerge on the cultural landscape, because we were trying to find out if it was a marker for psychopathology, which wasn't obvious at that point. Well, because it was a subcultural practice before that. It was circus people and prisoners and so forth that were tattooed and who were pierced. And then it spilled into the mainstream, and we were curious, as I was in the psychopathology and personality sub-department in the Harvard Department of Psychology, and I worked with a colleague of mine, Jill Hooley, and we never published this study. Many studies end up not published, but it was very interesting. The best predictor of tattooing and piercing was just creativity. There's no sign of assorted psychopathology, except the psychopathology associated with creativity. And you might say, well, what's that? And it's like, well, most creative ideas are stupid and wrong. So, you know, why shouldn't you have ideas? Well, because most of your ideas aren't any good. And how do you know that? Well, try starting a business. The probability that you're going to fail is extremely high. Most people who end up with a successful business have failed multiple times, because it's very hard to figure out what the market needs this moment. It's really hard, and so you'll flail around trying to hit that target. And if you're creative, you're going to come up with a lot of ideas, but that doesn't mean they're good. And even if they are good, doesn't mean they'll work. And so most people, because most people aren't creative, by the way, they're not even a little bit creative, and that's because creativity is a high-risk, high-return strategy. And if you win, you can win big, but the probability that you lose is pretty damn high. Hardly anybody makes any money from a book, and it's really hard to write a book. And like, how many books have you written? None. And how many successful books have you written? And, you know, like, there's a 1 in 100 chance maybe that you've written a book. I doubt if it's that high. Like, actually written and published a book. It's probably more like 1 in 1,000. And then 99.9% of books sell less than 200 copies. So you got a 1 in a million chance at best of writing a book that is going to be successful. You know, and you might ask, well, then why bother? And the answer is, well, most people don't. That's how they solve that problem. Just don't do that, and then you won't fail. And most of you probably haven't written a symphony or even a song or a play, and you probably don't dance, but some of you do, but I doubt if you've ever generated a truly original dance except by accident, and then generally people will just laugh about that. So we studied creative achievement across a wide range of people. We had developed a 13-domain scale with 8 levels of competence in each domain. So on the musical front, it would be, you know, I have no training or interest in this area. You know, I've written original compositions that have been played internationally by major musicians, and you sum across all 13 domains, and the median score, which is the most typical score, is 0, and 70% of people score 0. And the next most common score is 1. And that's like, now you got 80% of people. Okay, what's my point? No matter where you land in the temperamental landscape, you're going to have your associated faults and temptations. And you're going to have your associated proclivity to your particular form of mental illness. So now, that might visit you if you're particularly unlucky, or you might fall into that if you're incautious. But you generally don't get an advantage without an attendant disadvantage. So that's on the genetic front. And then there's environmental variability, for sure. You can take a neurotic child. The studies have already been done on this. So some children by, let's say 2, although you can actually measure this by 6 months. So imagine you have a child in a room, a lab, and his or her mother is there, and the mother is sitting and the child's here, and then a little wheeled robot is remote controlled in by the experimenter. Well, some kids will just run right over and engage with the robot, and other kids will hide behind their mother and then sort of peek out. And the ones who hide are higher in negative emotion. And then if it's a baby-eating robot, they're not dead, so that's their strategy. Whereas the, you know, hey, your kids are going to go play with a strange dog at the playground, you know, or not. And sometimes that's real fun, and sometimes it's no fun at all. And sometimes it's the, you know, kid who's hiding behind his mother's legs that doesn't have his face torn off by the pit bull. So there's variability for a reason, you know. And then the more neurosis prone, the more kids more prone to negative emotion, they're going to suffer from a higher proclivity for depression and anxiety later in their life, and that's the price they pay for their threat sensitivity. But if you take those kids and you really encourage them to explore voluntarily instead of facilitating their proclivity to hide themselves, you can tilt them up into the normal range for negative emotion. And those studies have already been done. And so you're never going to take a kid who's really high in trait neuroticism and make them as low in trait neuroticism as someone, you know, at the 99.9th percentile genetically. You just can't. And maybe you could do it if you did nothing else than train that child like 12 hours a day for 10 years. But you can shift people a fair bit. And if you're introverted, you can learn extroverted skills. And if you're agreeable, you can learn to stand up for yourself. And if you're unconscientious, you can learn to discipline yourself, although that's a tricky one. Because you usually don't have the discipline to discipline yourself if you're unconscientious. So, and then in terms of habit, well, you become what you practice. And so if you're high in neuroticism, it's going to take a lot of practice to get you all calmed down. But that's what you do in psychotherapy with people all the time, because a large number of people who are in therapy have higher than average levels of negative emotion, and you help them become stronger. And the way you do that is by strategizing with them and encouraging them to confront the things that they're afraid of and avoiding, and they become more able and more courageous as a consequence of doing so. And you can shift people quite a lot doing that, and that's what you do when you learn, and that's how you teach kids, and it's the universal mechanism of adaptation. And you try to speed that up in psychotherapy, and you can do that for yourself, you know. Like, this is a really useful what would you call it? Ritual, routine. So, look, you've got a goal, and you'll see that as you progress towards the goal, there'll be obstacles that emerge, and some of them you don't want to confront. You're going to shy away from them, you know. So maybe I have a client, and they're being tyrannized at work, and they need to get another job. And to do that, they have to put their CV in order, and they're embarrassed about their CV, and they don't even want to open the file on their computer that contains their CV, which they haven't looked at for 10 years, and which contains nothing but a record of their dismal failures in the past, as far as they're concerned. And that's a box that's locked, that's Pandora's box with a dragon in it, and they don't want to go anywhere near it. And no wonder, you know. But if they're going to get another job, well, unless they get their resume together, they're stuck under the thumb of their local tyrant, and that's not a good deal. And so often what you do with someone like that is you say, just print your resume. Don't even look at the bloody thing. Just print it, turn it upside down, put it in an envelope, and bring it to the session the next week. And then the person will come back and say, you know, that task that we agreed on, because you have to agree on these things, I didn't do it. I couldn't even sit at the computer. And so then you say, well, do you think this week you could just sit at the computer and think about opening your resume? And they might say, yes. And then they come back the next week and said, you know, I didn't even sit at the computer and think about my resume. So then you say, okay, we'll do it right now. Okay, close your eyes. Okay, now, imagine your computer. Bring it to mind as vividly as you can. All right, now imagine you're walking into your room, and now the goal is to sit at your computer. So now why don't you tell me what happens? So imagine your office. Okay, now you're walking in. Now tell me what happens. You're going to walk towards your computer. Just describe it.
First I sit down,
Okay, and how are you feeling?
relaxed.
Oh, well, you're not much help in this particular example. No, you mean terrified out of your skull.
Oh, you want me to be terrified?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You didn't say that.
She's not very high in neuroticism, by the way, as you can tell because she's married to me. So, okay. So you're,
I'm terrified.
Okay, so what's happening? Good, good. So what's happening with your breathing?
Shallow.
Okay, so try to pay attention to your feet for a minute. Okay.
They're
now-
twitching.
They're twitching, yes. Okay, so just try to let them kind of sit heavily on the floor.
Okay.
Now pay attention to your calves and let them relax. And then you walk the person through their body and you say, now pay attention to your breathing. Just relax. Now you don't have to do this with people, but it's a good thing for them to learn. Okay, now, so how are you feeling? By the way, you're feeling slightly better.
I'm feeling slightly
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
Okay, good, good. Now, imagine that you just turn on your computer. Okay, so what happens when you just turn on your computer? You get more nervous.
I shallow breathe.
Yeah, okay. So now you get the point, and then you walk the person through turning on their computer and then opening up the dread folder and then reading the title of the horrible dragon resume and then maybe opening it. And then you say, that's good enough for this week. And then maybe the person can go home and just open their damn resume. And then maybe they can print it out and bring it to you. And then maybe you can go through the sub-reptiles one by one, you know, and clean out the snakes. It's like, well, what were you doing between 2011 and 2013? And the answer is, that is the last thing that I want to discuss with anyone, right? So there's a lacuna, there's a hole in the account, in the autobiographical account, and chaos itself is looking through that with all that disorder and shame and malevolence lurking in the background, and no one wants to look at that. You think, well, you didn't do a very good job between 2012 and 2013, and you've got a hole in your record, and we right, and we need to do something about that now. And so, you know, how do we address that so that you have a coherent account of yourself? And look, this could take a good while, right, to put that all back together. That's your whole past, to put that together in a manner that you could confidently bring forward to a new potential employer. But it's worth it if you escape from tyranny and you now have a coherent account of yourself and you've atoned for your past inadequacies, let's say, and you're ready to move forward. And partly what you do in therapy and partly what you should do with yourself is not hide all that in the fog, you know, so you know where you are and so you can figure out where you're going, and then practice doing that. And then as you practice doing that, then that's what you become, and that will lower your proclivity to negative emotion, definitely, as you put your life together. That's why it's useful to order your room. Chaotic room makes you anxious. Why? Too many pathways, man. You walk into someone's room and you think, what the hell is going on here? Maybe that's your teenager's bedroom. And you've pretty much summed it up in the question. It's like, yeah, it's a little slice of hell in that room, you know? And how do you feel when you're there? Like you'd rather be anywhere else. And no wonder, because everything in the room is broadcasting chaos and disorder at you. And so that's another thing I used to do with my clients, typical behavioral maneuver, which is, if you're anxious, organize your surroundings a bit. You know, simplify, declutter, organize bit by bit. Order, habitable order. The habitable order that is good. All of that. It's a recreation of the original Eden, metaphysically speaking. And you can do that very practically, and then you practice that, and that'll sort you out. You know, assuming you're not physically ill. And even then, sometimes, you know, to the degree you can get yourself, right together.
Yeah.
You know, bit by bit, you'll even push physical illness into abeyance, not least because you decrease your stress response, and that's fight or flight, and fight or flight stress responses inhibit your immune system. And so if you're always in a state of chaos, your immune system is suppressed and you're far more likely to become ill. So you put order in place of accidental chaos and everything snaps into place. And there isn't anything better you can do than that. And there's no limit to how much of that you can do. You know, you start locally. Start with the things that are right in front of you. There's plenty of problems that are right within your grasp. You know, they might seem trivial to you, but they're not, because the things you do aren't trivial. And that's just where you have to start. And then, you know, once you got yourself kind of ordered locally, well, then start making your relationships harmonious. And once you're good at that, then you got a whole group of people around you that are behind you, and then you can expand outward from there. And there's no end to that. That's the opportunity and responsibility. And that's the pathway to meaning, and that's the antidote to suffering. So those are all good things to know. And that's a good place to stop. So that's where we'll stop. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Very nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone. So the existentialists, this is what they were concerned about. You know, and the locus of their concern was basically Nietzsche. And you all know that, and the reason I concentrate on Nietzsche and also on Dostoevsky is because I think those two people summed up the 19th century. I really think that. And that the problems that they laid out and predicted would unfold in the 20th century were the problems that unfolded in the 20th century. So they got their predictions right. And I think they got their causality right too. And given the inability of social scientists, including psychologists, to predict large-term mass events, the fact that these two people managed it 30 to 40 years before the events unfolded, and even longer than that, seems to me that it's pretty much worthwhile to consider them psychologists. And certainly Nietzsche thought that of himself, and so did Dostoevsky for that matter. And they had immense influence on people like Freud and Jung and Rogers, all the people that we've been studying. Their thinking is lying underneath every issue we've discussed. This is Nietzsche's, one of Nietzsche's great statements. Of what is great, one must either be silent or speak with greatness. With greatness, that means cynically and with innocence. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. Our whole European culture is moving from some time now with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade as towards a catastrophe. Restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that's afraid to reflect. He that speaks here has conversely done nothing so far but to reflect, as a philosopher and solitary by instinct, who has found his advantage in standing aside, outside. Why has the advent of nihilism become necessary? Because the values we have had hitherto thus draw their final consequence. Because nihilism represents the ultimate logical extension of our great values and ideals. Because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. So one of Nietzsche's claims, for example, was that as Christianity in Europe transformed itself into science, He felt that one of the advantages to the Catholic domination of Europe for so many centuries was that the mind of the Catholic adherents who took the discipline seriously, or the dogma seriously, learned to interpret all events under the schema of a single theory. And he thought about that as a form of discipline. So you could imagine that if I want to teach you how to theorize, I might teach you a theory and have you adopt it. And Nietzsche's point would be that, well, that means you know a theory, but it also means something else. It also means that now you know how to theorize. And the important consequence of learning a theory may not be the theory, it may be that you've learned to theorize. Now, Nietzsche also pointed out that once you learn to theorize, you can separate yourself from the theory that gave rise to that knowledge. And so you can start to theorize even about the theory that you mastered. And he thought that's what happened to Europe as a consequence of its domination by Christianity, especially because of Christianity's essential insistence on the utility of the truth. Now, he thought that was transformed after Catholicism into scientific investigation, but that the spirit of theorizing and truth remained intact, and then that the consequence of that was that the European mind was disciplined by a dogma, then it freed itself from the dogma, then it turned its power on the dogma, and noted that the dogma itself seemed to be grounded in nothing that you could get a grip on, the way you grip things with an empirical mind. And so it fell apart. You know, and that's not saying much more than science posed a fatal challenge to religion. But it's saying it in a much more profound and interesting way. And it also explains why he makes this claim, that nihilism is the logical conclusion of the great values and ideals. So he didn't think about nihilism as a counter proposition, say, to dogmatic Christianity. He thought about it as the logical outcome of that. So now you think, well, is that relevant? Why is that relevant? Well, I think it's relevant for a lot of ideas, for a lot of reasons. The first question is, or the first observation might be, that a tremendous amount of mental illness, and this is an existential claim, is grounded in nihilism. When someone who's depressed comes to see you, what they often say is, I can't see any point in life. And that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, they see the meaning of life as suffering, which is a meaning, right? And that's not bearable. And then the question is, given that, why bother with it? And that's the fundamental question of suicide. And it's a philosophical question. I think it was Camus who said that the only real philosophical question was whether or not to commit suicide. Now, you know, that's a little dark. I mean, maybe old Camus could have used some SSRIs, but you get the point. And it's inappropriate, in my estimation, to even discuss something, even to discuss depression with someone who's depressed, especially if they're intelligent and open, and therefore more tilted towards philosophical wonderings, without actually addressing the issue. Why live in the face of suffering? Okay, so that's one problem. It's to the degree that you will find it difficult in your life to build anything solid under your feet that you can stand on and believe, have faith in, let's say, you're going to be adrift. And the reason for that is, a lot of the things you're going to have to do will be difficult, and they'll involve suffering, which is also an existential claim. So the existentialists, for example, they don't make the same claim Freud does. Freud claims that, in some sense, that the normal person is mentally healthy, apart from the mild distress of normal life. And then in order to be psychopathological, you have to have been hurt, and maybe multiple times, and there's other things that could contribute to that. But the existentialists would say, no, let's just wait a minute here. Maybe the fundamental condition of human beings is nihilism and suffering, and that something has to be produced to counter that in order for life to be tolerable. Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable proposition. Now, it's a strange proposition, because I've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen people who are tormented by existential ideas, who can't get them out of their mind, you know, ideas that relate to the meaning of life, and then other people, and concern about death, for example, and the extinguishing of everything that seems to have any value. It's a primary concern with them. And then I've seen other people for whom those questions never seem to arise. Now, I think those people are, first of all, I think they're conservative people. I don't think they're very open, and I think they're probably rather low in neuroticism. So they're not philosophically curious. They don't go up chains of abstractions. And even if they do, they don't necessarily get disturbed in the most profound areas of their being by the questioning. But that still leaves plenty of people in the other category. Now the nihilism, well, you know, nihilism and atheism are closely related. I don't think they're identical by any stretch of the imagination. Although I think it's difficult for atheism to describe why it's not essentially nihilistic. And that's Dostoevsky's big criticism, because Dostoevsky's claim was that without any fundamental value assumed, then there's no reason why you can't do anything you want. And that's his famous line, if there's no God, then everything is permitted. And all of Dostoevsky's novel writing is an exploration of that idea. And sometimes it's an exploration of what that idea might mean if it was acted out in the life of a given individual, and so that would be, say, Crime and Punishment. And another would be, say, in his book, The Devils or the Possessed, it's an examination of what that idea means if it's gripped by an individual who has social and political ambitions. And that's when Dostoevsky basically prophesied, so to speak, that one of the consequences of the death of God would be the rise, basically, of communist totalitarianism, because essentially that's what he predicted in The Devils. So that's pretty dead-on accurate prediction. It was really quite stunning to me when I came across it. And Nietzsche made exactly the same prediction, by the way. And so for those two men, the death of an ultimate meaning system, especially one that, you see, when you think about something like European Christianity, it's misleading in some sense, because the system of beliefs that constituted European Christianity and other great belief systems wasn't 2,000 years old. It was like 25,000 years old. You know, you can think about it as beginning at year zero, but it's a mistake from a historical perspective. The ideas that profound religious traditions are predicated on are generally grounded in ideas that are much, much older than the traditions themselves. And so, in some sense, when at the end of the 19th century, when things fell apart for us and we could no longer rely on our history-predicated morality to guide us, it wasn't merely that we lost an overlay, a psychological overlay that had been laid on humanity for 2,000 years. It was way deeper than that. We don't even know how old those ideas are. We have some idea about how old they are. They're at least as old as written culture. But we also know that the people who have been brought into the mainstreams of history, you know, as the world has united, the people who were not literate had mythologies that drew from the same themes. And some of those people, as far as we can tell, had lived a lifestyle that was essentially unchanged for 25,000 years. And so the Australian Aborigines are like that. So there's plenty of evidence that these ideas are extraordinarily old. And what that means is that when we separate from them, in some sense, not only do we separate from our philosophical presuppositions, but we separate from the historical consequences of our biology. It's a serious problem. And I think that's partly why it's very difficult to distinguish between someone who's nihilistic and someone who's mentally ill. That's not a radical claim. I mean, people, especially who are on the depressed side of the distribution, will tell you that they're nihilistic. You know, they may not use that terminology, although they often do. I just can't see any point. It's like, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter? It seems to be a fact that it matters. So it's an interesting fact. That's a phenomenological fact in some sense, because one of the things that Heidegger pointed out, and he was a founder of the phenomenological school, was that your primary orientation to the world, he thinks in a strange way, that your primary orientation to the world was one of care. So you could say, well, what characterizes your experience? What sort of creature are you? And Heidegger's answer would be, well, you're a creature who cares about things. Insofar as you're engaged in the world, your primary orientation is one of care. And you can think about that as a value, right? It's a consequence of your value orientation, and God only knows where that comes from. Part of it's biological, part of it's developmental, part of it's historical. It's very, very complex. But if you stop caring about everything, you're in trouble. And that's one of the things that seems to indicate that caring is actually a fundamental reality. You stop caring about things, you don't stop suffering. And it seems that unless the caring counterbalances the suffering, you can't maintain an even keel. And that's partly because it doesn't seem just, right? I mean, when terrible things happen to people, they always say, well, two things. How is it that being could be constituted in this manner? Like, what the hell's going on at the fundamental levels of reality that such suffering has to be the case? You'll certainly ask that if you have a child who's diagnosed with cancer, for example. Or you might think, well, why is this cruelty, as it appears, necessarily aimed at me right now in this place, when hypothetically it could have not happened at all, or perhaps been visited on someone more deserving, you know, which is the good are punished and the evil remain unpunished, something like that. So that produces, for human beings, that produces a cry it's a cry for justice. How can the world be constituted that way? And that seems to be built into us. Those aren't questions we can just avoid. They're questions that will arise in your psyche. They'll arise as fundamental questions when sufficiently terrible things happen to you. So the existentialists would say, well, those are conditions of existence. You're just stuck with that. It's part of human nature. It's part of human being to be perplexed by those questions. Then the question is, at least in part, is there any way of answering them? Nietzsche said, we require at some time new values. Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests? Point of departure. It is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration or corruption of all things as the cause of nihilism. Now, that's a typical Nietzschean phrase, because there are three profound ideas in that sentence, and each one is in a different phrase. So Nietzsche said at one point, I can write in a sentence what other people write in a book. And then he said, well, what other people can't even write in a book. And this sentence is a good example of that. So what does he say? Well, you know, if you see that people are suffering and in trouble, one thing you can say is that the reason for that is that the economic system is unjust and they're layered along the bottom, and that's the fundamental cause of their suffering. But Nietzsche doesn't allow that to be an interpretation, a causal interpretation, because he says there are multiple ways of interpreting your position. And mere absence of material luxury does not necessarily destine you to one perspective or another. Physiological degeneration. Well, people are unhappy or suffering because they're ill in some manner. Well, you could make that a matter of definition by saying that if you're suffering or unhappy, you are ill, but that's not a causal argument. It's just a different way of categorizing the data. And Nietzsche would reject that, because he would also note that there's some correlation between physiological health and meaning in life, but the correlation doesn't imply causality, and even if it did, the relationship is by no means perfect to the degree that you would want a relationship to be before you accepted it as relevant. Or corruption of all things. Well, that would be the idea that being itself is evil, like an evil trick, which is what Tolstoy said, by the way, when he wrote his Confessions. Because Tolstoy, at the height of his intellectual power, he was the most famous novelist in the world and unbelievably well regarded, well, throughout the world, but particularly in Russia. And he was a socially benevolent man and well regarded for his wisdom. For years, he was afraid to go outside with a rope or a gun because he thought he would either hang or shoot himself. And the reason for that was that he had been struck by the idea that life is so unbearable that it should be eradicated. And he couldn't think his way out of that. And it was a form of thought that was actually very characteristic of intellectuals in Russia during his time and in his place. I mean, Dostoevsky wrote about exactly the same sorts of things. But even Tolstoy noted that merely observing that the world was a corrupt and evil place was not necessarily enough to tilt people towards nihilism, because there seemed to be people who weren't nihilistic despite the fact that that seemed self-evident to him. And he thought Tolstoy actually turned to the Russian people. You know, he was very entranced by the idea of the folk and folk wisdom. And he turned to the Russian people as a source of new inspiration, like the peasantry. And Tolstoy actually fought for the freedom of the peasantry. And he felt that their simple faith, so to speak, was something truly admirable, rather than something pathetic and weak from an intellectual perspective. He strove to emulate that criticismless faith, but of course he couldn't do it, because once you've taken a bite out of the apple, there's no going back, so to speak. Nietzsche says, distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is, the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. Rather, it is one particular interpretation, the Christian moral one, that nihilism is rooted. The end of Christianity, at the hands of its own morality, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness, highly developed by Christianity, is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and of history. It's a rebound from God is the truth to the equally fanatical faith, all is false, an act of Buddhism. Skepticism regarding morality is what is decisive. The end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it has tried to escape into some beyond, leads to nihilism.